And now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Nathalie Savadadze, who is the Georgian ambassador to the European Union, and indeed, coincidentally, an alumnus of this university. So, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Links and the Center, for bringing me back to Oxford, where I spent many wonderful years. I was asked to give you a story of EU-Georgia relations and to locate it in the context of South Caucasus, and that's what I will try to do. And when we speak about South Caucasus, elusive is a very good word to be using. It's a very interesting, sensitive, strategic, sort of a non-region. It is a region geographically, but politically, so far, it is a known region. This may change, of course, over time, but at the moment, this is how it looks. We can also ask questions whether it is a region or it is a sub-region, which is a part of the wider region, and depending on the definition we choose, of course, we may adjust our expectations for regional cooperation. There are many unknowns around this region, but there are a few things that we do know. We know that there are 3 South Caucasus states that are small, and they're situated in between contending empires and strong regional powers. This means that they have to pay attention to the relative distribution of power among its neighbors and to the properties of competitive international system, which until recently has not been very favorable to small states. These 3 states are certainly aware of this, and in their pursuit of security and survival, have often been balancing and bandwagoning with the interests of aggressive neighboring powers. This follows neorealist logic of international system in which big powers compete and try to exert influence over weaker states. According to this logic, weaker states do not go against interests of more powerful ones without incurring considerable costs. Hence, normally they don't do so. Georgia is one of the 3 countries which stands out in its defiance of this logic. Since independence, it has declared Western orientation to be its foreign policy goal and has been actively trying to advance on the path of European and Euro-Atlantic integration, which means EU and NATO membership. Georgians disagree virtually on everything, and its foreign policy orientation is a glaring exception. This is closest we can get for having a political and societal consensus. Despite the history which disconnected Georgia from Europe, and despite many competing influences, including from Middle East and Russia, in the minds of majority of Georgians, Europe is hope. For Georgia's elite, many educated in the West, Europe is the country's political destiny, a guarantor of security and a source of cultural affiliation. It is the only roadmap for Georgian foreign policy, and no alternatives are being seriously considered. So there is no ambiguity on our part what Georgia wants. It has made its choice, and it now tries to have this choice recognized by others. The latter is also part of my job. If I was to sum up the essence of what I do in Brussels as Georgia's representative, a lot of it is about trying to get Georgia's European choice and European ambitions recognized as legitimate and accepted as worthy of reciprocal commitment. This is not easy, since there is far more ambiguity on the side of Brussels than there is on the side of Tbilisi. There are questions of geographic distance and absence of the common land border. There is lack of historical memory connecting Georgia particularly with old Europe. And there is matter of culture, how European Georgia really is. This, in addition to real issues facing the EU itself, such as Brexit, disillusionment with enlargement, migration crisis, and the perennial elephant in the room, which is neighboring Russia. How Russia is going to react should Georgia be allowed to join the EU. If we are to judge by Russia's reaction to Ukraine's association agreement, one cannot blame Brussels for being cautious. Some in the EU are tired of ongoing confrontation with Russia over countries like Ukraine and Georgia and think it would be better off to find accommodation with Moscow instead of encroaching onto its traditional domain. Some feel like this, others strongly disagree. As my dear professor here in Oxford, Neil McFarlane, taught me, while it is tempting to think of states as unitary rational actors, it is also highly misleading to do so. There are many factors determining the policy choices states make, such as domestic interest groups, ideological considerations, types of leadership, and so on. And if this is the case for states, you can imagine that this is definitely the case for the EU, probably multiplied 28 times. It's therefore not surprising that the EU often finds it difficult to find a clear and unified position, and in its attempts to balance multiple interests, sometimes sends different messages to countries like us, Georgia. For instance, one institution, which is European Parliament, has repeatedly stated that Article 49 could apply to Georgia, provided that criteria are met. The executive branch of the EU, which is the Commission, refuses to give such perspective and, however remote, and urges us to work within the framework of the European Neighbourhood Policy and Eastern Partnership. The same is true of the Council, which consists of member states that are divided on this issue. One senior EU official, in a response to me, summed up the situation quite clearly and nicely. There is no consensus among member states that Georgia should be given membership perspective. But there is no consensus among member states that it should be denied it. So this is where we are right now, as we have often been, sort of somewhere and nowhere between Europe and the rest. But if we take a long view of the evolution of EU-Georgia relations, this is not a very bad place to be, after all, given where we started. We could divide the development of EU-Georgia relations roughly into three major phases. The first phase was when the EU found Georgia on the map of independent states after the collapse of the Soviet Union and began providing humanitarian assistance in which Georgia then was in dire need. EU supported Georgia's independence and sovereignty, but its engagement was rather limited, as it still considered this area to be Moscow's near abroad rather than shared neighborhood. The EU at that time was particularly focusing its attention on former communist Eastern Europe and unified Germany. The second phase can be described as partnership and cooperation phase, reflecting the title of the main agreement of the period. Here, a greater emphasis was put on technical assistance and wide-ranging cooperation with the aim of consolidating democracy, boosting trade and investment, developing market economy, and establishing an enhanced political dialogue. PCAs, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreements, were signed with all countries of the former Soviet Union with which the EU previously had no relations. Some, such as PCAs with Ukraine, Russia, and Moldova, also provided already the prospect of future free trade deals, while that with Georgia at that time did not envisage such possibility. Finally, the current phase can be defined as the association phase, which started with considerable intensification of EU-Georgia relations roughly from 2003 and introduction of Eastern Partnership Initiative. After 2008 Russia-Georgia war, which ended with the EU-mediated ceasefire of the French presidency, EU felt urgency to strengthen the eastern dimension of its neighborhood policy. Consequently, Sweden and Poland put forward a proposal to establish Eastern Partnership encompassing 6 former Soviet countries, including all 3 countries of the South Caucasus, plus Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. The EAP, as Toivo mentioned, offered partners an opportunity to pursue closer ties with the EU proportional to their ambition and commitment to respect common values. Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine took advantage of opportunities offered by the EAP and signed association agreements, which includes DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreements. Soon after, that was in 2014, soon after they also received visa liberalization following implementation of respective visa liberalization action plans. I often say that signing of the association agreement is to date most concrete and tangible manifestation of Georgia's European choice. It is a commitment on our side to pursue European-style modernization and development, but most importantly, it is a reciprocal commitment rather than a unilateral one. It was a commonplace, and we've heard many times that Georgia was asking for this and that, and the EU saying maybe not yet, not now. This led some commentators to describe relations between us as being characterized by reciprocity deficit. Well, concluding association agreement with the CFTA is probably the biggest contribution to filling of this deficit. So what does it offer concretely? It moves away from earlier cooperation approach and establishes contractual relations between the EU and partner countries in the form of association. This means economic integration by offering opening to the common market and political approximation through a concrete reform agenda. Apart from the EEA countries, the European Economic Area countries like Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, and Western Balkan candidate countries, this is the closest one can get to EU, both in terms of access to the market and in terms of approximation to the acquis. Cooperation councils have been replaced by the Association Council as the highest decision-making body, which is underpinned by the work of the Association Committee and numerous subcommittees that meet on a regular basis, alternating between Brussels and Tbilisi. More Eurosceptical among you might say, well, all you got essentially was more meetings. While there is obviously more to it, this is also true, partially, but more meetings is not as inconsequential as it sounds. Association process creates considerable linkages between the EU and Georgia and institutionalizes them. Those of you who are familiar with the theory of Levitsky and Way on linkages, we can say that all 6 of linkages that they identify are covered by association. These are economic, intergovernmental, technocratic, social, informational, and civil society linkages. These are important not only for creating connections, people-to-people contacts and bureaucratic links, which they do, but they also add up into an effective leverage in the head of the EU. In the absence of accession perspective, it is the public interest and pressure onto the local government to adhere to the European agenda that strengthens EU's role and influence. According to same linkages theory, these are precisely linkages that create domestic ownership of Western, and in this case, European norms and values, and they reshape domestic distribution of power and resource and reduce the likelihood of emerging authoritarianism by creating local expectations for democracy and rule of law. In other words, it is through establishing these linkages that association agreement can try and meet its transformative ambitions without having a strong leverage which is built in the promise of accession. It's clear that association agreements we signed were modeled on the association and stabilization agreements signed by the countries of Southeast Europe and Central European countries. In the latter case, however, the explicit aim of these agreements was to prepare the signatory states for future accession negotiations. In the case of the CFTAs, with Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, no promise of the next step was mentioned, but neither was it ruled out. Even though the European neighborhood policy has its roots and shares its logic with enlargement policy, Brussels has been maintaining that the two policies now have to be kept separate. This difference between the early association agreements and the new ones with respect to their long-term ambition was never solved but left explicitly open due to the lack of consensus among the EU member states over this particular question. This indecision on the part of the EU, I would describe as a risky opportunity, because that's what it is. It's an opportunity for us, but it's a risky one. As long as there is no final no, and the EU remains unclear about limits of its boundaries, there is an opportunity for Georgia. It can continue knocking on the door and keep pushing EU in its various institutional guises to accept its bid. At the same time, however, it's a very risky business for a state situated in a highly contested neighborhood to build its national security and foreign policy strategy on a mere hope. Georgian elite and public alike are convinced that the country would be more secure, more prosperous, and more democratic as a member of the EU and NATO. And we are encouraged by these sort of mixed messages I mentioned earlier and continue to push for this and hope that this policy eventually will bear fruit. Meanwhile, of course, costs accrue. Russia sees Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic ambitions contrary to its interest, and it does not shy away from making its discontent known violently if need be. So what does this all mean for South Caucasus more broadly? First of all, it shows that the three countries in this small region are looking in different directions, which is why I described it in the beginning as a known region in a political sense. Armenia is a traditional ally of Russia, which has its historic reasons and now is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Armenia was about to sign association agreement as well and negotiated it in record speed, but then under pressure from Moscow, dropped this idea and instead joined the Eurasian Union. 4 years later, European Union negotiated a new deal with Armenia, which is not as deep and comprehensive, but still it is an important one. Azerbaijan maintains its independence and neutrality, neither showing great European aspirations nor demonstrating any interest in joining the Eurasian Union. Its policy of non-alliance is underpinned by Caspian oil and gas resources and ability to play a role of a major actor in the energy scene, particularly contributing to the energy security of the European Union. At the same time, Azerbaijan too is negotiating an agreement with the EU, which is happening upon its own initiative, and we have to wait a little and see what it will look like. Georgia does what I have been describing all along and maintains good neighborly relations with both its neighbors. Georgia is a home to a significant number of territorially concentrated minorities of both Armenian and Azeri ethnicity, and this is an additional factor why good neighborly relations with these two countries, as well as peace between them, is of such direct and vital interest to us. Secondly, despite differences, all three countries are interested in building close relations with the EU, even though degrees of closeness vary. This is one common factor that can bring the region closer together. Needless to say, Georgia is very keen for its neighbors to integrate more with the EU because simply it will be less isolated in its foreign policy pursuits and will build closer cooperation amongst the three. Developing regional cooperation in South Caucasus will make all three countries more secure and more prosperous. There's no doubt about it. It may take an external third actor to play a role of a pull factor, and this could be the EU. Finally, Georgia's neighbors in the region and beyond are watching whether Georgia will succeed in its realization of European ambitions or not. Georgia's transformation, democratization, and integration in the EU has a significant demonstration effect beyond its borders. If we could make it, given where we started and where we're located, it would be a great stimulus for democratic forces all around. And it also helps EU to play a role of a global actor, which can project influence by soft means and do so effectively. The distance between South Caucasus and Europe has been shrinking, both in physical sense and in the sense of perceptions. So geography in that sense is a relative category, and what Georgia tries to do is shift and blur lines between the center and periphery within Europe as well as between Europe and Asia. And I will conclude with a quote from Tony Judt, who recalls in his post-war that East and West, Asia and Europe were always walls in the mind at least as much as lines on the earth. Thank you.